Shalom, welcome to the Jewish View. My name is Rabbi Nachman Simon with the Chabados of Dalmar, together with my co-host Mark Ronich of Statewide News Service, JBizTechValley.com, and as you can see here, columnist for the Jewish Press.
And I'm having a lot of fun with all these three assignments, and the column in the Jewish Press is called Albany Beat, and I talk about how government relates to the Jewish community or doesn't, as the case may be.
All right.
Now, the person who's our guest today,
Okay.
we'll see what we can relate to the Jewish community, but Bruce Dearstyne is a New York State historian. And
A lot of Jews in New York State.
We're going to talk about the history of New York State, and he's an author, and he has a book, The Spirit of New York. If we can put that slide up, that would be great. And so, Bruce, welcome to the Jewish View.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
There should be a lot to talk about. The Jewish community is the biggest community of Jews, even outside Jerusalem. They say there's more Jews in New York City than there are in Jerusalem.
Well, there certainly should be. That sort of leads me to the first point when I'm interviewed, which is this book necessarily is selective. Even though it's a big book, for everything that's in there, there are 10 things that might have been in there that aren't. And so every time I've done a presentation on this, I've been asked about, well, why isn't this in there? And why isn't that in there? And why isn't the other thing in there? I don't go into the Jewish community in New York or any other communities as such. What I try to do in the book is to tell 16 interesting stories based around a single day, single event in New York history, what led up to it, and then what happened on that day and what happened as a result. So the first one happens to be April 22nd, 1777. Not a day that most New Yorkers know is a historic day, but that's the day New York State was born. The first constitution, state constitution, promulgated in Kingston, New York. So the book has a lot of information about a lot of things. I tried to look for dramatic events, really interesting people, stories that haven't been told very much, or where they have been, I can retell them, hopefully in a new and interesting way.
So is next year our 240th anniversary of the state?
Next year is, yes it is. And of course next year we have a vote coming up before the voters about whether to authorize another state constitutional convention. So hopefully the state will get interested in its own birthday and its own history. One of the reasons I wrote this book was that even people who've grown up in New York don't know as much as they should or might about New York State history. And I say in the preface, New York State and New Yorkers generally tend to be very confident, very almost assertive oftentimes. We all of us have that reputation, except when it comes to our history. And there, for some reason, we get very modest and reticent and almost shy.
And I'll tell you why I think that is because we want to be politically correct, or the people who would normally educate and tell those stories want to be politically correct, and they don't want to say the wrong verbiage that was culturally acceptable then, but not now. And therefore, when you say certain words in today's society that was said then, you get into trouble, and you just can't.
I don't know. I have another take on a little bit, Mark. I asked that to someone, and he says, I'm in New York, and you don't hear so much about, like you were just saying, colonial New York. There's a whole history there. Yes. Virginia, you think of, colonial Williamsburg. Just these southern states a little bit. That's their big thing. And New York, you don't even, like you say, people don't even think of colonial New York. The person answered me, there's so much in New York. Virginia, what's there anyway? But in New York, there's, Wall Street and Broadway and this. So colonial gets into the back seat.
But then the story of Peter Stuyvesant being anti-Semitic and
I'm not saying there's no history, but I'm just, it's
you have
interesting
issues that come up.
Well, you mentioned Virginia. That leads to one of my favorite little stories.
Okay. All right, there you go.
There's a series, been going 3 years, one more year ago, called Turn, Washington Spies on AMC. I don't know if you've seen it, if your viewers have seen it. It's very good. And it's based on actual events a spy ring, if you will, that helped George Washington, but it was located, headquartered in Setauket, Long Island, in New York City. Most of the action that is on that road between Setauket and New York City, some in southern Connecticut, some in northern New Jersey. It's a New York story. It's been written by 2 historians. It's 90% a New York story. The series is filmed entirely in Virginia. Entirely in Virginia, except for Long Island Sound, which is beautiful, but digital. So it's Virginia actors playing New Yorkers, playing Benedict Arnold in the next to last episode. But when you see the ads about tourism, there's a series of ads. You want to know the real story about Turn, where the real history happened? Now you would think, wow, it's New York, it's a New York story. No, Colonial Williamsburg, other places in Virginia where the filming took place, not places in New York where the history took place. So, to your point exactly, Virginia's good at this, good at promoting their own history. Right. I think in this case, good at taking some of our history and putting it to work.
And you would think that we have such a big campaign, promotional campaign,
yes,
that's going out throughout the country, that the state would have seized the moment and taken some spots on these.
Well, you do, and I hope they will in the 4th episode. We have a program in New York, which you probably know, called The Path Through History, which
yes,
Governor Cuomo started. It's pretty good in my opinion. It could be bigger and better and stronger, but it's a good start. It's geared toward heritage tourism, which is an important thing to be geared toward. But in order to make this stick, I think we need to do a better job teaching New York State history in the schools, where we don't do nearly as good a job as we should. We need to support local historical societies better, and we need to give more support and visibility to local government historians. New York State is the only state in the country to have officially designated local government historians, supposed to be in every county, town, city, and village.
I heard that. So we just had someone that said that. But they didn't say it's the only state in the country.
It is.
That's interesting.
It's the only state in the country. One of the Midwest states, I think Indiana, has a title that sounds similar, but they're people that work for the state. These are local folks appointed, supposed to be anyway, going back to Al Smith, 1919. Now, a lot of places don't have them, don't do a very good job with it, don't give them support. But this is one of New York's hidden advantages. We have a natural advantage there. We have a new state historian, as I mentioned before we came on, Devin Lander, a natural leader. I'm sure he's going to do great things. But we still don't capitalize on it as much as we should.
No, and I know this for a fact. You're absolutely right. We don't, in fact, I put together a little game that's based on like The Amazing Race, where you could go around the world without leaving New York State. So, and you could start over at Orient, right? The Asian part, right? Orient Point, or Mount Sinai, because we're on the Jewish View, and you start there, and the greatest number of municipalities that match a foreign country or a foreign city, you win a prize, and the most amount of money that you would spend in those municipalities, you'd win a prize. And you got tens of thousands of people that would scurry around New York State with swipe cards, and there'd be kiosks set up. Pokemon. And you can even have little dioramas or, setups, like there's a little village of Jerusalem in Yates County. So why not put the Wailing Wall, the Western Wall up, there, and then you stick.
Wonderful.
You
sure.
stick a note in the wall, and you as the clue to the next place, or something like that.
Well, our younger colleagues hearing this would say, what you need is an app.
Right.
Like Pokemon Go.
Yeah, that's what they say, Pokemon.
Then you'd have it.
Right. So we can do something like that here in New York State, and then people will see New York State, learn about New York State, hands-on, and not just in theory or
right.
With a name in a book. I mean, it's now you can actually visualize, and then because you're not spending so much time in any of these places, you say, "Wow, that was a great place in the Finger Lakes. Let's go back." And let's spend some time. Yeah. And the residual effect is absolutely incalculable.
Well, right down the
Yeah.
street is the Albany Institute of History and Art. New York, if you start from Long Island and go out to Westfield, there are something like 700 historical societies and historical museums in this state, not counting the state sites, and not counting the federal sites like the FDR Library. So we have a terrific network of local government historians, but local historical societies. And oftentimes, and I've worked in this field for a lot of years, I've traveled throughout the whole state, and oftentimes what you find, people locally have a great deal of in-depth knowledge about things that you can come in from the outside, ride through the town or whatever, and you never would get. So I think that's absolutely right. There are so many things that started out in New York City in particular, some here in Albany and some elsewhere, and then kind of spread to the rest of the country. And so, for instance, the first state civil rights law in the nation, people think, well, it couldn't be here, it must be, well, it's no, New York State, well, it must be FDR, no, Tom Dewey, kind of a conservative Republican.
Yeah.
First state civil rights law in 1945. The NAACP started here, New York City, in 1909. And the labor movement, a lot of it took place took root in New York City. A lot of the regulations that we now take for granted, like safe working conditions and school attendance and so on, started here in New York. And people used to look, and still to some degree do, look to New York for leadership. So
That's why we are the empire state.
right. Well, the way I put it in the book, and I've said lots of times, New York is the nation's historically most significant state.
Yes.
From the beginning, I think, to the present. Now, I might be a little biased because I'm a New Yorker.
But
Like-
you know,
like we
I
are.
went to Richmond, Virginia. You talked about Virginia earlier. And you take a tour of their capital, and they're still back in the Confederacy.
Well,
They
what do you
have
mean?
not moved on. And when they hear me talk, and I'm not talking like this, they know that I'm a Northerner. They don't want to talk to me.
Really? I know.
And they just, it's really, but they have this whole, half the tour is about the Confederacy. They haven't left there. They haven't left there yet.
Well, the South has its own view of its own history. But in some ways, their state programs are very, very strong. And if you take just another example, we've just been through the sesquicentennial of the Civil War.
Right.
Virginia, the Carolinas, Massachusetts, Pennsylvania, Ohio had commissions or committees or some quasi-official group that commemorated the state's history. In some of the states in the South, that was hard to do because you get into very difficult issues about slavery and so on. But New York, which contributed more men to the Civil War than any other state, took more casualties than any other state.
I didn't know that.
Contributed more money than any other state,
Right.
and contributed more goods than any other state. And in some ways, New York State, in some measures, outproduced the entire Confederacy. We didn't do anything, not officially. We had a little group, that sort of an ad hoc group, no state funding or whatever. So
Right. I know, there was a lot of uproar.
the Civil
and
War
so-
passed, Civil War sesquicentennial passed, without New York kind of stepping forward and say, look, without New York, it's hard to see how the North could have won. New Yorkers made a tremendous sacrifice during the war. The war changed this state. Thousands of men left. Most of them returned, not all. It was a heavy casualty rate. But when they returned, that changed society again.
Right.
The economy changed. It was kind of agricultural when the war began, geared up a lot of industry to produce things for the war, and that sort of started the real industrial revolution here afterwards.
It's just amazing. And, how we ignore milestones and then we celebrate other things that are less significant because it's thrust upon us. I was at the 200th anniversary, the 100th anniversary of the Statue of Liberty,
Probably, yeah.
and it was 1986. So
Yeah.
1886 was the Statue of Liberty?
Sounds right, yep.
Yeah,
Okay.
100, yeah.
So, the Governor Mario Cuomo, had one of the ships that we own, that the state owns, and Ronald Reagan was president, and he had one of the federal ships on the other side of the thing, and you really thought that, wow, Republican, Democrat, two great orators, they're going to start fighting and shooting each other, you know. But we had this great celebration of the Statue of Liberty, and I'll never forget being on that boat, and Yitzhak Perlman was there, and there were so many other greats that you just, you know, it just meant so much, and we should be continuing to honor and remember what our history is instead of ignoring it, and we should be putting money into it. We do have funds for this. You know, I mean, whenever there's a disaster, the governor can come up with millions of dollars.
Yep, absolutely.
And why not? Why does that have to be a disaster? Why can't we do it for something that's happy, that's uplifting, that's forward-looking?
Will be economic also, more tourism, and would be quite good for the state altogether.
You also write in your book about James Fenimore Cooper and the last of the Mohicans.
Right.
Explain the significance.
Well,
is Cooperstown really named after James Fenimore Cooper?
Cooperstown is actually named after his father,
Okay.
William Cooper, and James Fenimore Cooper, his son, grew up there, and became an author sort of by chance. He needed some money. He needed to make money.
Right.
He had gotten an inheritance from his father, but not as much as he expected. And one day the story goes, he was reading an English novel, and he said to his wife, I could do better than this. And Susan, his wife, said, I challenge you to do it. And so he began writing, and his first novel was kind of a flop. But the next two, which were based on basically American themes, frontier, exciting adventure, New York State, were bestsellers. And his next one, which was The Last of the Mohicans, published in 1826, wound up being one of the most important, influential books ever written in America.
So he got it right on the third try.
Well, he got it right.
Well,
but
why is that?
Well, it's because he was able to sort of fictionalize and sensationalize an actual historical event. As it happens, just over this weekend, I was giving a presentation on this at Fort William Henry. That's where the actual event took place in 1757. And to make a long story short, part of the French and Indian Wars, the English had this Fort William Henry. The French besieged it and took it over. And they did so on the understanding that the English would go to Fort Edward, which was a stronghold, under flag of truce, with their guns but no bullets, and they could take wives, those people who had wives. There were other people, civilians, children, and so on. But when they got outside of the fort, the French forces, Native American allies, beset them and killed some of them and tried to take their provisions and their guns and so on. That's because the French had sort of promised their Indian allies plunder, but then hadn't delivered. Now this was an evil thing. In that region, by the way, Lake George, people go there all the time. It's one of the bloodiest areas in the North American continent for all the fighting that took place there. People don't realize that.
For which war?
Mostly French and Indian War.
Okay.
Yeah, because there were a series of battles. French and Indian War went from from to 1763, but the colonial wars, of which it was part, went from 1689 to 1763. So a lot of fighting, a lot of it here in New York, a lot of casualties, and so on. So Cooper picked up that event, inserted some people into it that weren't there, including a character named Hawkeye, or Leatherstocking, or Natty Bumppo. He goes by different names. And to make, again, a very long story, and this book, by the way, is worth reading. Last Mohican is still worth reading. The daughters of the commander at Fort William Henry were kidnapped by an evil fellow for various reasons, and then rescued, and then kidnapped again, and rescued again by Hawkeye and his friends. One of whom says at the end, I am the last of the Mohicans. It's right toward the end of the book. It's very touching. And he says that he's an older man after his son has been killed. Well, that's one of the many things Cooper sort of made up. He wasn't the last of the Mohicans. There were lots of Mohicans around. There still are. So if you read the book, it's history up to a point. And then beyond that is fiction. And part of it is Cooper had a great imagination, made things up. But part of it is his own research. So some of the sources he used, if you look back at the historiography, they themselves had relied on other sources which had sensationalized things and weren't reliable. So you have kind of unreliable, sensationalized sources purporting to be real history, Cooper stepping forward and making use of them and making a brilliant novel, but even more, if you will, sensationalized and fictional. So one of the books he used was by a guy named Timothy Dwight, who was president of Yale, and he was naturally drawn to that because he had gone to Yale. And this book, and Dwight himself, authoritative historian. But as it turned out, he had used sources which were not all that reliable. So that's one of the reasons that the book is great. It's a good read. It's a lot of adventure, a lot of color, and so on.
I wanted to ask you about Elizabeth Cady Stanton.
Okay.
Because if we're going to talk about men, we got to talk about women.
Yes,
Otherwise,
yep.
I'm going to get letters.
Oh, well.
So that's part of your book too. So what's the significance there, and the women's suffragette movement?
Well, there's a chapter on that starts out with the famous Seneca Falls Convention in 1848, but essentially then follows out Elizabeth Cady Stanton for the next 50 years because she lived until 1902 and was immensely active and influential. And I often say, if people ask me, who's your favorite character in the book? If you could go back into history and spend an hour with somebody, who would it be? It would be Elizabeth Cady Stanton. I didn't know much about her when I started the research. I came out of the research and the writing being a big fan.
And she lived where?
Well, she lived mostly in Seneca Falls, some in New York City, and a little while in New Jersey. Mostly Seneca Falls. And
where was she born then?
She was born in Johnstown in 1815.
That's where I was. Okay, that's where that plaque was on the bank.
Could be. Of course, Bob Cudmore comes from there. Just talking about that area. Married another reformer, a fellow who was actually more interested in anti-slavery. Moved around some with him, including Boston, and wound up in Seneca Falls because her father, as it turned out, had some property there and just gave it to her and her husband, and they built there. But she's one of many characters in the book that if you sort of met her on the street before she did all this, you'd say, this is just another average New Yorker. There are so many, or quite a few at least, people in there that are sort of average New Yorkers that suddenly step forward when the time is right. And so she...
This isn't Last of the Mohicans, or what?
No, this is Elizabeth Cady Stanton.
This is Elizabeth Cady Stanton.
And the women's suffragette movement.
Yeah, the women's suffrage movement. Yeah, so she and some colleagues organized the Seneca Falls Convention, July 1848. Almost
It's interesting, it was so
almost
early over
moment.
here. I mean, because the women didn't even get to vote till what, 1919? Am I correct with that? I mean, that's like about 60, 70 years.
Absolutely. Yep.
You know, I mean, you'd think, all right, a few years beforehand they started their movement.
Well, not only that, there were women running for office and they couldn't even vote for themselves.
Well, the great convention and the great manifesto is 1848. Women don't get the right to vote, you're absolutely right, till 1917 here in New York and 1920 nationally. So New York's not a leader here because women had the right to vote in some of the western states before they did here. And as it turns out, Stanton died in 1902,
Right.
but her daughter, one of her daughters, was a leader in the suffrage movement, which succeeded a few years later. But Stanton was undefeated, never deterred, personally brave, articulate, wrote a lot of things. And just two stories real quick. One of the things I don't think I put it in the book, but I've read it.
It was an outtake.
There's a lot of
joking.
She and some colleagues were here in Albany, and they were talking about anti-slavery. And there were people who thought that was going to bring civil war, which of course eventually did. And they said, we're going to disrupt this talk. We're not going to let these people talk, these women talk and others. And the mayor of Albany said, I won't have this in Albany. He called out city police, they were there, detectives in the crowd, And he went and sat on the stage himself with a gun in his lap.
Was there someone before Erastus Corning?
Yes, this was a few years before Erastus Corning. And still in all, these people threatened and hooted and howled and disrupted the presentation.
Yes.
And that wasn't the only time when she felt personally menaced, because the message she had, which was not just women should have right to vote, it's about marriage equality and some other things, a lot of people found threatening. Now, the other part of the story, real quick, is the day before she died, ill and in her daughter's home in New York City, blind or nearly blind, she wrote her last article, which she sent off, and she wrote a letter to Theodore Roosevelt, who was president, and she said something like this: Mr. President, I've been working on this my whole life. You, Theodore Roosevelt, can do for women what your predecessor, your Republican predecessor, Abraham Lincoln, did for slaves. He freed the slaves. You can give women the right to vote. And of course, Theodore Roosevelt later came around to endorse that, but not in 1902.
Okay.
So,
And I just want to quickly, because we're running out of time, that Glen Curtiss was a rival of the Wright Brothers, but we actually had a flying machine here in New York State before the Wright Brothers.
well, I'm not sure that's quite
Or
right.
did we-
Glen Curtiss, New York's great aviation pioneer, rival of the Wright Brothers, contemporary of the Wright Brothers, in some ways ahead of the Wright Brothers, was the first person to give a pre-announced, publicly accessible, officially certified flight of an airplane in the United States, 1908. After the Wright Brothers flights, but the Wright Brothers tended to be more closed in, not officially certified, and so on. And so Glen Curtiss is one of those New Yorkers who was personally kind of modest and self-effacing, not nearly as self-promoting as the Wright Brothers, and for that reason, among others, less well remembered. But he's also known for the first airplane flight from right here in Albany on May 1910 to New York City, first time ever, which I cover in the book. And then the next year, 1911, demonstrating the military potential of the airplane for the Navy, getting the first contract with the Navy to build planes for the Navy and train Navy units.
Well, we could go on. I have so many things to talk to you about. In fact, one of the things I want to leave you food for thought, why don't we number the governors of New York State the way we number the presidents of New York State? The presidents of the United States. So, for example, Grover Cleveland is number, 22nd and 24th?
Sounds right. He gets two
And
numbers,
then-
yeah.
Okay, he gets two numbers.
Right.
But in New York State, Governor Clinton gets one number, but he was 4 times with 4 different, he was served, and then he didn't serve, and then he served again, and then he didn't serve, and then he served. And it was and he's only considered as one. So we have to, no, because because this governor would be 8 more numbers down the line if I did the renumbering. And there's something to think about.
That's interesting. I'd never thought of that before.
And I'll ask the state historian.
There you
who's
go.
on
There you go.
Now, I also want to let you know, this is our 3rd year anniversary. You are the 370th guest.
Oh.
And we have a little celebration. I think Rabbi
Yes,
Simon, we have a cookie here.
Oh, thank
and
you.
it's it's Pas Yisrael, but
It's kosher, that's the main
it's
thing.
kosher,
Right.
and Rabbi Simon can eat it. That's how kosher it is.
It's kosher
So-
for all of us, but he didn't bring a l'chaim, Mark, over
No.
here. Should have brought a little
You brought your
l'chaim.
l'chaim.
All right, on water. But in
So-
any case, we'll say l'chaim to you.
Thank
That
you.
means to life. You're doing great work, and I love history, and Mark said at the beginning, we can connect it to the Jewish view, because I think there's a lack of knowing Jewish history, and I think that's abysmal, because people don't know where you're going if you don't know where you're coming from. And I really think that as students today in the United States and in New York State, you don't know what kind of rich heritage you have unless you learn about it.
Absolutely.
And I think that really is a big lack in America. Maybe everybody knows how to use a computer. That's great, but I mean, also history is a very, very important of life.
So let's get that slide up one more time for the cover of The Spirit of New York. And
There we
you
go. That's
Very
the
nice,
beautiful
very
book.
nice.
and keep
And-
on going.
Yep, Bruce, you know.
Yeah, we'll
Thank
have
you.
to read it ourselves
you.
over here because I love history, and our viewers, I'm sure, would enjoy it too. So keep on going with success.
Yes.
Thank you very much.
All the best.
All right.